Well, thanks for coming out. I'll be talking about this book, What the Heck Are You Up to, Mr. President? Jimmy Carter, America's Malaise, and the Speech That Should Have Changed the Country. I don't usually do just straight readings because I find that those are relatively boring to just hear someone read from the book. So what I'm going to do is kind of give a fairly informal talk about the main themes of the book, and then I'll read parts of it out to try to emphasize those areas that I think may be of most interest to you. The term malaise is probably the term that most of us associate with Jimmy Carter's presidency in the long term. It's the term that he's known supposedly to have invented and that has defined his presidency. And one of the best ways to understand the long-term impact of this term defining his presidency, of course, is pop culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's known as episode 80 of The Simpsons. Which focuses one of its themes on the citizens of Springfield wanting to have a statue of a famous president. But of course, they don't have a lot of money, so they can't get Lincoln, they can't get Washington. The only thing they can settle on is Jimmy Carter. And then there's the unveiling of the statue where they pull the robe off, and there's Jimmy Carter in these kind of schlumpy-looking clothes, looking really, really sad. And then below him are emblazoned the words, "Malaise forever." And not only does that happen, but then the citizens of Springfield scream out, "He was the worst monster in history!" And they tear down the statue and start smashing the windows in the local town and go into a riot. So it's a kind of perfect example of Jimmy Carter's legacy and the legacy of malaise. Now, the source of the term is the speech that Jimmy Carter gives on July 15th, 1979. So we're fast approaching its 30th anniversary. And the typical take of historians is that this speech was a colossal mistake, a colossal error on Jimmy Carter's part, and that it essentially assured him to be defeated in 1980. I'm going to read a quote from a historian who gives the kind of typical take. This was written just a little while ago. Here's the typical take on the speech. By sermonizing, Carter appeared to be abdicating his role as leader and blaming the people themselves for their own afflictions. That is, that Jimmy Carter was taking the blame off of his own presidency and putting it onto the shoulders of citizens. And this is the standard take of the speech, and therefore this was a kind of dodging speech, and it was essentially Jimmy Carter admitting he was a weak and ineffective president. Now, if you read the speech itself, which many people don't who talk about it, you'll find that there's a lot in it where you could say, this sounds like a president who's castigating the American people. And I'll just read you a few highlights of the speech he gives on July 15th. He's supposed to be talking about the energy crisis, and then all of a sudden he starts talking about things like this. We worship self-indulgence and consumption, and we are mired in fragmentation and self-interest. This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth, and it is a warning. I realize that now more than ever as president, I need your help. You could say two things about that. One, it sounds like he's saying that the American people are in fact marked by selfishness and consumption and so forth and so on. But the second part of it is that Jimmy Carter is also admitting to his own weaknesses, his own frailties, and is not blaming the American people wholeheartedly as it's often understood. Now, the real interesting thing about this speech is this. As much as it sounds like he's lashing out against the American people, condemning them for consumerism and materialism, he gets a bump in his polls immediately following the speech of 11%. And for Jimmy Carter, this was rare. This never happened. This was really shocking. Not only does he get a bump in his polls, he gets tons of mail sent to the White House, almost all of it favorable. The White House switchboard lights up immediately after he's done with the speech, and almost all of the calls are positive. People calling in saying, I'll ride a moped to work, I'll cut down on my energy consumption, I'll do what's necessary to pull us through this crisis. So there seems to be a counterintuitive thing going on. Jimmy Carter goes out, condemns the American people, and yet the American people seem to love it, if you want to just put it that boldly. And that's in some ways the conundrum that I wanted to kind of explore more in this book. And I think it's time that we revisit Carter and Carter's speech, especially with the contemporary context of our own energy crisis. Now, the general problem of revisiting the speech and revisiting Jimmy Carter is also the problem of revisiting the 1970s. As a decade goes, I'm sure most of you feel this way, the 1970s are known to kind of suck. They're a bad time. This is the time of decline. This is the time of decadence. This is the time of superficial disco, so forth and so on. There's a real reason to say that this was a kind of crummy decade. And many conservative scholars have also argued that there's a narrative that goes along with the crummy decade, which is that in the 1970s, America fell away from its greatness. 1980, along comes a man on a great white horse. Ronald Reagan saves the country, pulls it out of its mire, and returns us to greatness. That's a fairly standard take that a lot of conservative scholars use to explain the time and to explain the decade. My book tries to complicate both our understanding of Carter and of the 70s by looking at the 70s not just as a time of decadence and disco, which it definitely was, but also as a time of introspection. I think there was a lot of kind of soul searching going on in the 70s. It was a time when people felt comfortable being tough on America. The films of Apocalypse Now, for instance, come out during this time. Manhattan is a famous movie that Jimmy Carter himself shows twice at the White House during this period of time that I'm studying. And there's a real sense of humility that America has gone through a hard time, through Vietnam, through Watergate. It can perhaps return to something, but it can never return to the kind of innocence that it might once have had. I think there's a moral seriousness to the 70s that I think it's important for us to explore more today. So I think it's time to reevaluate the decade, and I think it's time to reevaluate Carter. And the best way that I thought to do this was to take the speech that he was so well known for and that defined his presidency and try to explore it again and to be a little bit more critical and reflective about it. Now, the easiest way to think about this speech is as a critique of consumerism and abundance getting in the way of Americans understanding the real problems of the energy crisis. There's an argument that we've become so reliant upon fossil fuels and too reliant upon them, and that we really need to confront this issue, but until we understand our civic crisis, we won't be able to confront the energy crisis. And there is also the theme that we need to call upon citizens to embark upon a project of civic sacrifice, to understand the limits that are placed upon Americans at this point in time in history, and to only doing that would we get off our reliance upon foreign oil. Now, here's the way that I tell the story. Whenever you commit to writing a book like this, your fear is that you may have opened yourself up to doing a lot of research into things that are not very interesting. I found this to be the exact opposite. This period of time that I focus on, which is really April of 1979 to July of 1979, and then carrying through to the election of November 1980, this is a crazy period of time. It's a wild period of time. And there's three ways that you can understand, especially the spring and summer of 1979, as a wild time. Number one are gas lines, and I'll talk a little bit about gas lines and what they were like. Number two is a trucker strike, which was so important in defining the feeling of the period. And number three is a good old-fashioned riot. And you have all of these three things happening during the course of the time from April to July of 1979. Let me start with the gas lines. The gas lines start in Los Angeles in spring. They then move east during the spring and summer of 79. It's due to a limit of supplies. Iran has cut off its oil supply due to being in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. It also has something to do with the rationing system that I won't go into detail about here. But let me just give you a sense of what gas lines were like and what the spring and summer of 1979 were like. Here's a description of what gas lines were like, especially out east as they've come from Los Angeles. Ensuring that your car had sufficient gas went something like this during the month of June in New York, Washington, D.C., and the suburbs of New Jersey. Search for an open gas station. 95% of the stations in New York City were closed. Wait in a long line for up to 6 hours. They ran for miles in New Jersey. Get to the pump and then find out that there's no gas left. An attendant might say that a truck was on its way with resupplies, prompting a further wait. Those who saw the sign "last car" on the car that was last in line would go into a panic. Sometimes they would steal it and put it into their own cars in hope of finally getting gas. They would idle their engines in long lines. One estimate, a historian points out, suggested that America's motorists in the spring and summer of 79 may have wasted 150 barrels of oil a day waiting in line. And then others ran out of gas before getting into line, coasting or pushing to the pumps. And that included actually Jimmy Carter's press secretary, Jody Powell, who found himself coasting into a gas line and remembered it quite well when I interviewed him for this book. The gas lines are also violent.